It is 2 in the morning, and she's on the phone with her best friend, who is crying about a breakup nobody saw coming. Her voice is soft, patient. She says all the right things. You're not too much. You're not hard to love. This is not your fault. She stays on that call for 2 hours, and when it finally ends, she feels something close to peace, the quiet satisfaction of having helped someone she loves put themselves back together. Then she puts the phone down, catches her own reflection in the dark screen, and something in her chest goes cold. A single thought arrives, uninvited, automatic, and utterly without mercy. You are such a fraud. You could never say any of that to yourself and mean it. This is not a rare moment. This is happening right now, tonight, in millions of bedrooms, in millions of group chats, in millions of quiet drives home after someone has once again been the strong one, the calm one, the one who always knows what to say. There is a version of this story unfolding in your own life, or in the life of someone sitting 3 feet away from you. A person capable of extraordinary tenderness toward everyone, except the one person they spend every single day trapped inside of. So here is the question this entire story is built around. How does a human being become fluent in kindness toward strangers, friends, even people who have hurt them, while remaining utterly merciless toward themselves? How does someone become the person everyone calls when they are falling apart while quietly falling apart themselves in total silence? This is not a contradiction. It is not hypocrisy, though it often looks and feels exactly like that from the inside. It is one of the most well-documented, most misunderstood patterns in modern psychology. And once you understand where it comes from, you will never look at the nice one in your friend group the same way again. To understand this, we cannot start with the adult sitting quietly with a self-hating thought at 2 in the morning. We have to go back much further, to a much smaller version of that same person, because almost nothing about this pattern begins in adulthood. It begins in a house, at a dinner table, in a bedroom with the door closed, sometimes years before that person could even form the words to describe what was happening to them. Picture a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, growing up in a home where love is not stable. Maybe a parent's mood shifts without warning, calm one moment, furious the next, and there's no way to predict which version of that parent is going to walk through the door. Maybe there is outright criticism, the kind that lands not on behavior but on identity itself. You are so lazy, you're so much trouble, why can't you just be easier? Maybe there is nothing so dramatic as shouting at all, just a chronic, quiet withdrawal of warmth whenever the child expresses a need, a want, an inconvenient emotion. In psychology, all of these environments share one brutal commonality. The child learns, at an age which the brain is still wiring its most fundamental beliefs about safety and love, that their own needs are dangerous. This is where a concept called the fawn response comes in, and it changes the entire way we should think about kindness. For Pete Walker, working for years with survivors of long-term childhood trauma, identified a fourth, fawning. Unlike fight, which confronts danger, or flight, which runs from it, fawning, this is not a personality trait a child chooses. It is a survival strategy the nervous system installs without permission, the same way it installs the instinct to flinch from fire. And it works, at least in the short term. A child who becomes hyper-attuned to a parent's moods, who anticipates needs before they are spoken, who apologizes first and asks for nothing, often does experience less conflict, less punishment, more fragile moments of approval. The nervous system takes note. This strategy keeps me safer than the alternative. Do it again. Do it always. But here's the piece almost nobody talks about, the piece that explains everything, about the person who is endlessly kind to others and endlessly cruel to themselves. That same child, in the process of learning to manage everyone else's emotions, has to do something else in parallel. They have to explain to themselves why the love around them feels so unstable. And children, developmentally, are almost never capable of concluding that the adult in charge of them is flawed or unreliable. A small child's brain is simply not built to hold the idea that the person they depend on for survival might be the unpredictable one. It is far too destabilizing. So the child's mind reaches for the only other explanation available. It must be me. If I were easier, calmer, smarter, prettier, quieter, more grateful, none of this would happen. The instability gets internalized not as evidence of someone else's dysfunction, but as proof of the child's own inadequacy. This single quiet act of reasoning performed by a child who has no other tools available becomes the architecture for an entire adult life. The child grows into someone who has 2 fully developed, fully separate systems, running side by side. One system, aimed outward, is warm, generous, forgiving, endlessly patient with other people's flaws. The other, aimed inward, is a prosecutor with an airtight case and zero interest in mercy. Psychologists sometimes call this the inner critic, but that name almost undersells how sophisticated and how loud this internal voice becomes. It is not a passing thought. For many people, it operates almost constantly, a low hum of self-surveillance running underneath every interaction, grading performance, cataloging mistakes, waiting to pounce the instant something goes even slightly wrong. There is a reason this internal voice feels so convincing, so much like objective truth rather than an old learned habit. Researchers studying self-criticism have found that harsh self-judgment often develops as a kind of psychological armor. If you attack yourself first, faster and harder than anyone else possibly could, you never have to be caught off guard by someone else's disapproval. The logic, buried somewhere beneath conscious awareness, goes something like this. If I already know I am not good enough, your rejection cannot surprise me, cannot wound me the way it would if I believed I deserved better. Self-hatred, in this light, is not simply low self-esteem. It is a defense mechanism, one that trades constant internal pain for the illusion of control over external pain. And once a nervous system has learned that trade feels safer, it does not release that belief easily just because the original danger, the unpredictable parent, the unstable home, is decades in the past. This is where a second piece of the puzzle becomes essential, something psychologists call sociometer theory. Developed by the psychologist Mark Leary, the theory proposes something that sounds almost too simple to be true, and yet reshapes how we understand self-esteem entirely. Self-esteem, according to this research, is not primarily a measure of how much you like yourself in some abstract internal sense. It functions more like a gauge, constantly monitoring how included, how feelings. It could end your life. Rejection meant losing access to food, protection, community, survival itself. So the brain built an early warning system, an internal dial that drops sharply the moment it senses declining. Acceptance from others and self-esteem is the needle on that dial. For a child raised in an unstable environment, that internal gauge never gets a chance to calibrate to a baseline of safety. It stays perpetually tuned to threat, constantly scanning for the earliest signs that approval might be withdrawn. And the adult that child becomes carries that same hypersensitive gauge into every relationship, every workplace, every friendship for the rest of their life, which is precisely why becoming useful to others feels less like a choice and more like an emergency response. Being kind, being helpful, being endlessly available is not simply generosity. For many people locked in this pattern, it is the only mechanism they have ever trusted to keep that internal needle from crashing toward rejection. Kindness becomes currency. And like any currency spent under threat of poverty, it gets spent compulsively without ever accumulating any real savings of self-worth to draw from later. Here is where the psychology gets genuinely unsettling, because you would think that being kind, being genuinely helpful to other human beings would eventually build up enough internal evidence to override the old belief of unworthiness. If you have spent 15 years being the reliable one, the one who shows up, the one who remembers birthdays and stays on the phone at 2 a.m, shouldn't that mountain of evidence eventually convince the inner prosecutor to drop the case? For most people trapped in this cycle, the devastating answer is no. And the reason lies in a concept called self-verification theory, developed by the psychologist William Swan. Self-verification theory reveals something deeply counterintuitive about human motivation. We do not simply seek approval or positive feedback about ourselves, we seek consistency. Human beings are so deeply wired to protect a stable, predictable sense of identity that when praise or love contradicts a firmly held negative self-belief, the brain often does not experience that praise as a relief. It experiences it as confusing, even threatening, because it destabilizes a self-concept that has been under construction since early childhood. Studies on this theory have found something remarkable, that people with negative self-views will sometimes gravitate toward relationships, feedback, even criticism that confirms what they already believe about themselves, because a familiar negative feels psychologically safer than an unfamiliar positive. This is part of why compliments can feel almost unbearable to someone who has spent their life believing they are fundamentally not enough. A friend says, "You're the kindest person I know," and instead of absorbing it, some internal alarm quietly whispers, "They don't actually know me. If they did, they would see what I see." This is the trap. The kinder this person is to others, the more praise and gratitude they receive, and the more that praise clashes with a self-concept built in childhood, the harder the internal system works to reject it. Would think differently if he really knew me. I just got lucky that time. Psychologists call this discounting, and it functions almost like an immune response, treating positive information about the self as a foreign body to be neutralized rather than a nutrient to be absorbed. The very system that makes someone endlessly attuned to others. Emotional needs is the same system working around the clock to make sure no kindness ever successfully lands on themselves. Consider a man in his 30s, well-liked at work, the person colleagues quietly go to when a project is falling apart, because he stays calm, absorbs the panic in the room, and somehow makes everyone else feel like things are under control. He gets a promotion. His manager tells him in front of the whole team that the department would not have hit its numbers without him. He smiles, says thank you, and spends the entire drive home privately dismantling the compliment piece by piece. They only said that because they need me to stay. They don't actually know how much I got lucky this quarter. If they really looked closely, they would see how much I am faking. This is not modesty. It is the discounting mechanism in real time, the same nervous system that will spend the following weekend gently, patiently talking a friend through a career setback, reminding that friend of every strength they cannot currently see in themselves, refusing point blank to extend that same generosity of interpretation to its own evidence file. Now, layer onto this something almost cruelly ironic, something drawn straight from neuroscience. When a person performs an act of genuine kindness towards someone else, their brain does not stay neutral. Researchers studying what has come to be called the helper's high have found that acts of generosity activate the brain's mesolimbic reward pathway, the same deep reward circuitry involved in pleasure and motivation more broadly. Helping someone triggers a release of dopamine, delivering that small hit of satisfaction and reinforcement, alongside oxytocin, the hormone tied to bonding, trust, and connection, and even endorphins, the body's own natural painkillers. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, measurably drops. The nervous system quite literally calms down. For a person whose sense of safety has always depended on being useful to others, this is not a small detail. It means that being kind does not just feel morally good, it is neurochemically rewarding in a very literal, very physical sense. Every act of generosity delivers a small hit of the exact soothing the person never reliably received as a child, which means that kindness toward others is not simply learned behavior for this person. It becomes, over years, something closer to a self-soothing mechanism, one of the only reliably effective ones they have. And that is precisely why it becomes so difficult to turn inward and offer that same soothing to themselves. The nervous system has never once been rewarded for self-directed compassion. It has only ever been rewarded, biochemically and relationally, for compassion aimed outward. This is the moment where the psychologist Christine Neff's research becomes essential to understanding the way out of this pattern, because Neff was among the first researchers to formally define and measure something called self-compassion, distinct from self-esteem entirely. Her research identifies three core components: self-kindness instead of harsh judgment when something goes wrong, a recognition of common humanity, the understanding that suffering, failure, and imperfection are part of what every human being shares, rather than proof of personal defectiveness, and mindfulness, the ability to hold painful feelings in balanced awareness, rather than either suppressing them or being completely swallowed by them. What Neff's research reveals, again and again, is that people who struggle most with self-compassion are often not people who lack the capacity for compassion itself. Quite the opposite. Many of the people who score lowest on measures of self-compassion score remarkably high on measures of compassion for others. This is the paradox at the very heart of this entire psychological pattern. The wiring for empathy is not missing. It is simply pointed in one direction and one direction only, because somewhere along the way, usually in childhood, being kind to yourself was never modeled, never reinforced, and sometimes actively punished as selfish, indulgent, or dramatic. Meanwhile, being kind to others was consistently rewarded with the one thing that child needed most desperately to survive: a little bit of safety. There's also something worth understanding about why self-compassion, when finally offered, can feel almost physically uncomfortable to people who have lived inside self-hatred for years. Clinicians working with self-loathing describe a phenomenon in which people actively resist compassion directed at themselves, not because they cannot understand its value intellectually, but because it feels, on some deep and almost bodily level, like letting themselves off the hook. If the harsh internal voice has spent decades functioning as a kind of internal disciplinarian, keeping standards high, keeping behavior in check, keeping the person good enough to remain loved, then softening that voice can feel less like healing and more like abandoning the very system that has kept them safe. This is why simply telling someone who hates themselves to just be nicer to yourself so often fails. It is not a lack of information. It is an old, deeply conditioned nervous system refusing to disarm a defense it still believes it needs. There's a crucial distinction hiding underneath all of this, one that researcher Brené Brown has spent decades untangling, and it explains why this particular flavor of self-hatred feels so much heavier than ordinary regret. Brown draws a sharp line between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something bad. It is uncomfortable, but it is workable because it is attached to a specific behavior that can be examined, repaired, or avoided next time. Shame says something far more dangerous. I am bad. It is not attached to an action at all. It is attached to identity itself, and identity does not offer a clear repair mechanism the way behavior does. You can apologize for something you did. It is far harder to know how to apologize for who you supposedly are. People raised in homes where mistakes were met not with correction, but with contempt. Not that was the wrong choice, but what is wrong with you, tend to grow up fluent in shame rather than guilt. Research has found guilt to be associated with accountability, repair, and growth, while shame correlates instead with depression, addiction, aggression, and a corrosive erosion of the belief that change is even possible. This is precisely why the inner voice in this pattern rarely says, "That was a mistake." It says something closer to, "Of course you did that. That is exactly the kind of person you are." One sentence targets behavior, the other targets a soul. This shame-based self-talk also tends to travel through a small, recognizable set of thinking patterns that cognitive psychologists have cataloged as distortions, twisted logic that feels completely rational from the inside, while quietly stacking the deck against the person thinking it. All-or-nothing thinking turns a single missed deadline into proof of total. Everything else, mind reading assumes with total confidence and zero actual evidence that a friend's slightly delayed text reply. There is also a specific emotional signature that shows up again and again in people. This pattern, one that researchers studying attention and emotional regulation have calling rejection, sensitive dysphoria, an intense, almost physically painful reaction to perceived criticism or rejection, even when that rejection was never actually intended. A slightly flat tone in a text message, a meeting invite that did not include them, a joke among friends that landed a beat too sharp. For most people, these moments register as minor static. For someone whose sociometer was calibrated under real childhood threat, they can trigger a full-body wave of shame within seconds, a flush of heat, a racing heart, an overwhelming urge to apologize for something nobody has actually accused them of. This is not oversensitivity in the dismissive sense that word usually implies. It is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, scanning constantly for the earliest possible sign that love or safety might be withdrawn, because once, a very long time ago, that scanning genuinely kept them safer. There's another layer to the story that deserves real attention, because it explains why this pattern so often shows up specifically as caretaking, as being the helper, the fixer, the emotional glue holding a friend group or family together. Many of the people who grow up learning to fawn for safety also grow up in what psychologists describe as parentified roles, meaning they were, in some meaningful way, put in charge, managing an adult's emotions long before they were developmentally ready for that responsibility. A child comforting a parent through a divorce, a child monitoring a parent's drinking, a child learning to read a room the instant they walk through the front door, adjusting their own volume, their own needs, their own presence based on what they sense the adults around them can tolerate that day. This child does not get the luxury of simply being a child. They become, in effect, a small, unpaid emotional laborer inside their own home. Grown into adulthood, this person often becomes extraordinarily skilled at exactly the same task, reading a room instantly, sensing before anyone else notices it, absorbing other people's emotional overflow without being. Friends describe them as intuitive, as easy to talk to, as someone who just gets it. What almost nobody around them realizes is that this skill was forged under duress, refined in an environment where getting it wrong once carried real consequences. And crucially, this hyper-attunement to other people's inner worlds rarely comes paired with an equal attunement to their own. Years of practice reading everyone else's emotional weather leaves very little bandwidth, and often very little permission, to check the forecast inside themselves. This pattern also intersects with something researchers studying moral behavior have documented, sometimes called moral licensing, though the version showing up here runs in a quieter, more personal direction than the term usually describes in a lab setting. For many people, carrying deep, unspoken shame, doing something good does not feel like an expression of who they already are. It feels like something closer to rent, a payment, made to temporarily justify taking up space in the world. Being kind is not simply an extension of character. It becomes proof submitted to an invisible internal court that they are allowed to exist, allowed to be forgiven for whatever unnamed flaw they believe is lurking underneath the surface. This is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with logistics or time management. It is exhausting because the debt this system is trying to pay off can never actually be settled. There is no version of enough kindness that finally satisfies an internal belief rooted not in behavior, but in identity. You cannot outperform a belief that says the problem is who you are. This same wiring tends to follow a person directly into their romantic relationships, often in ways that look, from the outside, like devotion, but feel, from the inside, like quiet terror wearing devotion's clothes. Attachment researchers have long observed that people who grew up with inconsistent caregiving often develop what is described as an anxio, us attachment style, a pattern marked by hypervigilance toward a partner's mood, an outsized fear of abandonment, and a tendency to overgive in relationships as a way of preemptively securing love rather than simply enjoying it. This is why someone who cannot ask a coworker for a 2-day deadline extension without rehearsing the request 11 times in the shower can, paradoxically, absorb a partner's disrespect for years without ever raising their voice. Self-verification theory offers a chilling explanation here too. A person who has internalized the belief that they are fundamentally hard to love may unconsciously feel more at home with a partner who confirms that belief through criticism or withdrawal than with a partner who offers steady, unconditional warmth, because the steady warmth, however wonderful it sounds on paper, does not match the internal blueprint. It creates dissonance instead of comfort. This is part of the deeply unfair machinery behind why some of the kindest, most emotionally generous people end up again and again in relationships that quietly starve them, mistaking the familiar ache of not being enough for the ordinary texture of love itself. The costs of living this way for years, even decades, are not merely emotional. Researchers examining chronic self-criticism and suppressed emotional needs have connected these patterns to real physical consequences: elevated stress hormone levels sustained over long periods, disrupted sleep, digestive issues, a heightened vulnerability to anxiety and depression. The body, it turns out, keeps a very precise account of every unmet need, every swallowed boundary, every moment someone said yes while their entire nervous system was screaming no. Burnout in this population often looks different from ordinary exhaustion. It frequently arrives not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow, creeping resentment, a quiet, disorienting anger toward the very people they have spent years taking care of, followed almost immediately by a fresh wave of guilt for daring to feel resentful in the first place. Round and round it goes. So what actually breaks this cycle? Psychology does not offer a single, tidy answer, but decades of research point toward a few consistent starting points, and understanding them changes the entire framing of what healing here actually requires. The first insight is one that surprises almost everyone who has lived inside this pattern for years. Healing does not begin with becoming less kind to others. That instinct to protect yourself by withdrawing your generosity from the world usually backfires, breeding isolation and guilt rather than genuine safety. Healing begins instead with the much harder, much slower work of extending that same quality of attention inward, treating your own exhaustion, your own disappointment, your own ordinary human mistakes with the same patience you would automatically offer a friend in the same position. Therapists working in this space often use a deceptively simple technique, sometimes called the self-compassion break, developed out of Kristen Neff's research. In a moment of struggle, the person is asked to pause and consciously do 3 things. Acknowledge the pain honestly, without minimizing it or rushing past it. Remind themselves that struggle and imperfection are part of a shared human experience rather than personal proof of inadequacy. And then, quite literally, offer themselves words of kindness, sometimes even a physical gesture like a hand placed gently over the heart, mimicking the same comfort a caring friend's touch might provide. For someone who has spent decades treating themselves as the one exception to every rule of compassion they apply everywhere else, this can feel awkward, even absurd at first. Researchers studying loving-kindness practices have found that with consistent practice over weeks and months, these techniques measurably increase self-compassion and reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression, evidence that the nervous system, however rigidly trained, retains the capacity to learn a new pattern. There is also, for many people, real value in simply naming the mechanism itself, understanding that the fawn response was never a character flaw, but a survival adaptation forged under conditions where a small child had genuinely limited options, tends to dissolve at least some of the shame surrounding it. This is not an excuse to stay stuck. It is closer to a map, one that finally explains why the old pattern made sense once, so that a person can begin, carefully and often with professional support, to ask whether it still serves them now, decades removed from the original danger that built it. Boundaries, too, play a far larger role in this healing process than most people expect, because for someone raised to equate their own needs with danger, setting a boundary for the very first time can feel less like self-care and more like defiance, like waiting for punishment that this time never actually arrives. Learning to tolerate someone else's disappointment without immediately collapsing into apology or self-blame is, for this population, one of the single most difficult and most transformative psychological skills to build. It is, in a very real sense, learning to trust that love does not actually depend on constant appeasement, that the sociometer built in childhood was calibrated for a threat that, in most adult relationships, simply no longer exists. What makes this entire story worth telling is not simply the diagnosis of a painful pattern. It is the recognition of something almost beautiful hiding inside the wreckage of it. The same capacity that produces devastating self. Hatred, an intense, finely tuned sensitivity to emotional nuance, a deep instinct to notice suffering and respond to it, is not a flaw to be eliminated. It is a genuine strength, one forged, however painfully, under conditions that demanded it. The goal was never to become less kind, less attuned, less capable of extraordinary compassion. The goal is to finally let that same instinct turn inward, to become, for the first time, one of the people this person has always been so quietly, so instinctively good at taking care of. If you recognize any piece of this story in your own life, in the way you replay a small mistake for hours while forgiving a friend's far larger, one instantly in the way compliments slide off you while criticism lodges somewhere deep and permanent, in the exhaustion of being everyone's safe place while feeling like you have none of your own, know that this pattern has a name, a history, and a documented path away from it. It was never really about being too sensitive or too much or not enough. It was a young nervous system, doing exactly what it needed to do to survive an environment that demanded constant vigilance and offered very little safety in return. That system kept a small, frightened child alive. It simply never learned that the danger eventually ended, and that the kindness it has spent an entire lifetime perfecting for everyone else was always quietly meant to include the person carrying it too.